welcome to Talk This.
It's dangerous to podcast alone.
I'm your poor vocal hygiene host, Madelyn.
I'm your, theoretically I took a voiceover class and I should be better at not trailing off at the end of my sentences, but I do that anyway, host Emma.
And this week, it's another side quest episode of the show, where we talk about a topic of one of your lovely hosts' choosing. This week, it's Emma's turn to pick what we're going to be discussing. So, Emma, what's this week's episode about?
This week, we're hopping back to something that I think we talked about a few times pretty early on in the show, because the strike was actually going on during that time, I'm pretty sure. But we were talking about voice acting in video games. How does it differ from other voice acting areas? What was up with that strike a few years ago? What's the issue what's the deal with representation right now, specifically in video games? How does dubbing work versus otherwise? And what is COVID doing? That last was just a broad question.
It's a pretty big question for a 1-hour podcast. Let alone there are other questions.
Yes.
What's COVID doing?
I mentioned that specifically because that's what got me starting to think about this topic in the first place. I played, I think, a couple, maybe on our last 6-week side quest, I talked about playing 13 Sentinels, Aegis Rim. And the English dub for that, it actually ended up delaying the English release by a couple of weeks because they had to finish it up because they had to transition from doing in-house studio recordings to everybody was recording from home instead. So it was interesting to look into all the different sort of processes that had to change because of that, because there was a lot more work for the sound editors and engineers to be doing to make everybody sound the same. So I was thinking about that, and I also watched a video about anime dubbing, actually, from the Cartoon Cypher, about representation in the anime dubbing sphere. So that was also got me thinking a little bit about voice acting in general. And that was the idea behind this topic.
Well, it was a big transition for the Talk This team when we went from recording in our fancy in-house studio to in-home recording in March, wasn't it?
It's, our show sounds fine, but certainly we do not have fancy in-house studios, no. Nor do we have a team of sound engineers working on it. We just have me. Just one Emma.
I used to record in my closet?
Yeah. The good old days.
Those were the days.
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot to talk about voice acting. Where do you want to get started? Stop me before I start reading the SAG contract to everyone.
Maybe we don't start with the strike, just talk about how it works generally, right?
Totally. So, voice acting is terrible. Is the short, it's so much worse than any other kind of acting that you could possibly do. It's also better, but in many ways it is much worse.
If you do some commercials, I think I tend to hear are the way to go for voice acting, right?
Commercials are the way to go for any kind of acting. Maybe that is advice that is dated to, the 1980s, to be clear. But if you were an actor in the 1980s, commercials, definitely the way to go. Because...
There's still lots of YouTube ads,
No, I'm not saying there's not commercial work. I'm just saying... I just remember my acting professor, one of my acting professors in college, as if I had one getting an acting degree. One of my acting professors talking about how he booked a giant ad, or a series of giant ads, I think, when he was still an actor and not a teacher. And he was like, I lived on that for years. With the residuals and it being a series of ads. And I don't think that that's how ads work anymore. Yeah. Maybe if you're Flo.
Still, though, I think you still get like residuals and
No,
stuff.
you do still get residuals, yes.
Which is, I mean, was that part of the new contracts that they get some of that?
No, absolutely
No. Yeah, that's
not.
what I figured.
That was something they asked for, and that zero. No.
Yes. So, regardless of whether commercial industry is as big of a boon as the 1980s, it's still probably the better way to go for money making, if not for creativity, I guess.
Depends on how you like to work.
Yes.
Anyway, if you've read about video game voice acting before, you might be familiar with some of these kind of general outlines of what it's like. But for the most part, you don't really get to know what you're doing, except now in very, very vague terms, until you arrive.
Yeah.
That changed a little bit as a result of the video game voice actors strike in 2016 and 2017. You do now get this like very, very, like they don't even have to tell you the real name of the project. They just have to tell you the code name of the project. I really like that they have to tell you if it falls into one of these 4 genres. I love, when we talked about genre a little while ago, and I love that SAG was like, here are the 4 genres. Here they are if you're curious. Fighting/shooter, role-playing game, simulation slash racing slash sports. There's a lot in there, isn't there? Or puzzle/casual /kids and family /strategy.
There's a lot in there.
There's a lot
Who
in
knew
there.
Mortal Kombat and Call of Duty were the same genre of video game?
I sort of get that from the perspective of, okay, what kind of efforts are you being asked to do, right?
Fire Emblem and Cooking Mama Cookstar.
Would Cooking Mama Cookstar be puzzle casual or simulation? Probably both.
Yeah.
You can select multiple.
There you go.
Anyway, the point being, you get just a touch of information about the game if you're in the union. If you're not in the union, you don't even have to get that touch of information about the game.
Yeah.
And you walk in, you don't know who you're playing, really, probably. I love that in the SAG contract they have to tell you if you're being asked to reprise a role. Imagine
did they not have to ask you that before?
No, apparently not. Imagine Troy Baker walking in. And it's like, by the way...
Well, Troy Baker is no longer asked to reprise roles. He is too expensive, I assume.
I know. I'm just, like, imagine walking in. Imagine Haley Joel Osment walking in. Like, by the way, this is Kingdom Hearts 2.
You don't say.
Like, twist. Anyway, so yeah, you don't really know anything about what you're doing, which is just so... It really gives you a lot of respect for the work that these people do, and a lot of sympathy for all of the terrible voice acting that exists in older games, because that's hard.
Yeah. I mean, I was looking at, like, an interview walking through the 13 Sentinels work from home process with the voice director, and I think the localization editor. And, like, a lot of what the voice director had to do was, like, provide context for the scenes that they were voicing, right? So a lot of it really does come down to whether your voice director is,
competent.
able to give you good direction.
It does feel like, I mean, this would be a lot of work, right? And you're juggling 2 people dealing with construction noise and crying children and stuff. But it does feel like in COVID times, it should be way more feasible to have people doing scenes at the same time.
That's true, I guess.
I don't know. I watched a Q&A with the Agretzko cast after season 3 came out, and they also recorded everything from home. And I couldn't tell. I was trying to suss out from the Q&A if they got to record kind of together or if it was all separate, and I couldn't tell because they're all such pros that they weren't like it sucked. I didn't get to talk to anyone. So yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's still you would maybe have issues with scheduling no matter what.
That's true.
Right.
Well, nobody was doing anything in March, April, but yeah.
Still.
It's so true. For the theater projects, like in March, April, we could just like email anybody and they'd be like, yeah, I'm at home. Sure. And now people are doing stuff again.
Yeah. But yeah, the ordering's interesting because, like, again, like, referring to this 13 Sentinels article, like, one actor had done all of his lines in studio. They just finished his. So it's, like, interesting to think about that, like, oh, like, some actors hadn't recorded any lines by the time Kaiji Tang had been done with all of his. Which is weird to think about when you, like, look at the final project, right?
It really is. And it's just like, how does anybody have any... It's weird to think about having any creative control over your character. Whoever is the first person to record has a ton of creative control. And then after that, just none. Just absolutely zero.
That's true. It's a little bit different with this because, again, with dubbing work, like, a lot of that is also already done for you, too.
Oh my gosh, like, did you see that thread on Twitter about Final Fantasy VII Remake?
I think so, yeah.
And, like, how just, like, how does anybody even act at all?
Yeah.
It's impossible. Okay, go ahead and talk about dubbing. I stepped on your toes there.
No, we can come back to that, because you should probably go into it more for the listeners if you remember the specifics of it. But...
So I don't remember the super specifics, but the idea being that, obviously, for Final Fantasy VII Remake, the animations, like, it's like, basically a fully voiced game, right? Yeah. There's nothing in that game that's not voiced.
No, right? It's fully voiced.
Okay. I couldn't remember if there's anything that was just, like, text. But it's fully voiced, and obviously, like, the lip flaps pretty much exist already. And so I think the thread was more about the challenges of writing a script for that. Where it's like, not only did you have to you had to translate the Japanese to something that was, like, basically within, like, a tenth of a second of the same amount of time, but they also talked about, it's like, well, if Aerith kind of punches her fist 2/3 of the way through, you need to make sure that your line makes sense so that she punches her fists 2/3 of the way through, even though, you know, the grammar of how sentences work isn't the same at all.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure, I don't know for Final Fantasy VII Remake, but, like, the lip flaps are things that are, like, changeable, right? Like, you'll see, like, you can tell the difference between Kingdom Hearts games that have had the lip flaps altered versus the ones that haven't, for instance. But, all the, like, the shot composition and the other animations are not alterable, so those things then have to be, like, hitting in the correct point for the words that they're saying, yeah.
And then, once the script team has managed that, then the actor has to say it just right, so it's the exact right amount of time and punches at the right moment.
Yep.
How did even a single line get recorded?
Yeah. And the thing with dubbing, too, is, like, when you are taking a character that someone has already interpreted, right? Like, you can put your own spin on it, but at the end of the day, you don't really want to be varying too far from the original interpretation, right? Because you're portraying the same character. And you just want it to be that same portrayal except translated to a different audience, right? So there's some creative limitations there already in terms of what you can do with it, right? You can't change the emotion. You can't necessarily, like, change the emotion of a line, for instance.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Not significantly, anyway.
Yeah.
Unless everyone's on the same page about it. Unless you've called up everybody and broken your NDAs and been like, we're gonna make this a joke. Then it would work great.
I mean, you know, localization's a whole other... The Yakuza team, for it, like, that reminded me, like, talking to everybody, talking about making a joke. Like, the Yakuza localization team is so blessed.
Are they? How hard must that be to localize?
I'm sure it's very hard, but they're blessed in terms of, like, the original team gives them, like, a lot of freedom to work with stuff, is more what I meant.
That's a whole other
That's not about
voice
voice acting.
There. Imagine... I think a lot, because I've been playing so much of the Yakuza games, about what it must be like to be in the booth recording the karaoke. I think about it a lot. I think about it a lot. like, what is it like to be Majima's actor doing his, like, just off-the-walls karaoke.
Fun,
Like,
probably.
shrieking.
Good fun time.
He does, the videos I've seen of him, like, doing it, he does seem to be having a good time. Not with karaoke, specifically. But yeah, I mean, another thing, speaking of, like, weird things, that you, like, it's not just lines that you're recording, it's every grunt that your character ever makes.
Yeah. Like, all voice acting have, like, efforts, right? If you're voicing, like, an animated action show, you'll be doing a lot of grunting, too. But for video games specifically, because they have, like, most games have, like, combat, you're making a lot of grunting noise for a lot of different situations.
I wonder about
Is this
that a
the
lot.
you've been shot grunting noise? Is this the you've been punched grunting noise? Is this the you fell from a slightly too high height
Okay,
grunting noise?
pop quiz time. Emma, do all three of those.
No.
Go. No, you gotta. Quick, do you've been shot.
Ah!
Okay, that was weak. But okay.
I don't want to blow out the microphone.
You're right, you're right.
This isn't a...
Okay, fine. I will give you a pass. Do you've been punched.
Oh.
Nice. It was a punch to the nose, in case anybody missed it. For the face. And then you've fallen from a slightly too far height.
Ugh.
Nice, nice.
Yeah, there we go.
Hire Emma.
I hope you could really visualize that in your head.
Hire Emma for your non-union effort work. Oh, boy. Yeah, I often wonder how many different individual efforts you have to record.
I mean, probably depends on the game, obviously, but probably a lot. The Last of Us Part 2, probably like half efforts. You have to have the perfect grunting noise for every single situation.
It's true. How much time do voice actors spend at home practicing various grunts? Being like to their partner, like, what did you think that was? What did you think that was?
I don't know the answer to that one.
Training. You gotta train for your craft, people. And that's
Exactly.
what I'm saying. You, too, could be a famous voice actor if you grunted at home a little bit more.
That's the key.
So yeah, that's what video game voice acting is like.
Sometimes you also have to do mocap.
That, too. Sometimes you get ping-ponged.
Yep.
I don't understand mocap at all.
You put on some suits and you do some stuff. I was reading a little bit, because there's lots of articles about, like, the kiss scene from The Last of Us Part 2, that one trailer that they showed.
Mm-hmm.
That was, like, an actually well-animated kiss, and people were like, wow, look at that! So there were some articles about, like, the mocapping process for that. So, like, I know, right? This is like, there's a lot of Velcro noises.
God! I was just imagining, like...
But yeah, they have to kiss each other, and then they had to, like, kiss the air so that they could get more precise references. So, like, kissing each other was more for, like, the body and sort of generalness, and then having to kiss the air for, like, the facial expressions.
Do they have, like, nerds on their lips? Like, that kind of, like, candy lip?
I don't know
aesthetic?
specifically, yeah.
That's what I'm imagining. I'm imagining, like, the, like, sugar lip kind of thing, and they're like... That's my effort for a kiss, by the way.
Yeah. And then they had to do, like, a lot of, like, sort of stunt, quote-unquote, mocapping, too, of, like, rolling around on the floor and stuff. Sometimes that's the same, the voice actor does it. Sometimes they get, different people to do the mocap. But it is generally a part, if you're in, like, a big budget video game, you're gonna be putting on your mocap suit.
I mean, in some ways, like, that's cool. And in some ways, that makes it feel much more like any other kind of acting.
Yeah. It's just like you're acting in one of the Marvel movies, right?
Yeah, it's
The same
like
level
that.
of, like, imagination effort.
totally. Those are weird to think about, too.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm an actor that can't act unless I have something to hold.
I just think it's funny to think of, like, the, like, filming and, like, before special effects gets to it, you know?
Yeah.
Just hilarious to me, a little bit.
The videos of them riding the dragons in Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
And I do feel like mocap, and maybe this is a good time to start talking about the strike a little bit.
Sure.
Does blur the line a little bit more in terms of the actor's contribution to the game and the extent of that, which was a big deal in the ask for residuals that ultimately failed miserably in this voice actor strike 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, it's also just, like, you're asking for a lot more, like, physical exertion for them, and there's a certain amount of, like, risk involved, especially if you're asking them to, like, roll around on the floor, which makes those jobs, like, feel, you know, like maybe they should be getting some more sort of risk compensation or whatever.
Yeah. I do think that one of the things that did make it in, I don't remember, I didn't pay quite as much attention to the motion capture stuff because it's voice acting for this side quest.
Yeah.
But I do think that it's now, there needs to be a stunt coordinator of some kind.
It's good.
Which, like, yikes, buddy.
Yeah.
That, a reminder, this agreement really only applies to these, like, 11 companies.
Yeah.
On this level. It's like, yikes-a-roo. You weren't bringing stunt coordinators? Oof. Big oof. Anyway, so the voice actor strike. If you weren't around when we talked about it on Talk This, the beginnings. Then here's the recap. So from October 2016 to September 2017, 340 days, which is the longest SAG-AFTRA strike ever. Video game actors who are members of that Screen Actors Guild, and I can know AFTRA is like the Audio Federation. No, American Federation of Television and Radio Actors, I think.
Yeah, I think so.
They went on strike against 11 video game companies. That's Activision, Blindlight, Core of Discovery Films, Disney Character Voices, Electronic Arts, Formosa Interactive, Insomniac, Interactive Associates, Take-Two Interactive, VoiceWorks Productions, and WB Games. Because they wanted better conditions and they wanted better compensation. And one of the big things that was at the front of it, and depending on who you ask, did they really want this, or was this just, starting big so they would go home with something? Who knows? But they came into it wanting some kind of actually really small residuals. This was not...
I imagine it was a combination of both things.
I mean, of course.
They probably wanted it, but also thought they would start with that,
To be clear, though, the residuals that are being asked for here were not... Like, I read an interview where Troy Baker was talking about, like, if I had gotten, like, 0.25% of the first week's sales of... I don't remember what he was...
One of his games.
He was like, that'd be $1 million. It wasn't that. That might be too much. But it was something like $3,000 for every 500,000 games sold. Or like a day rate for every 500,000 games sold, up to $2 million. So it's like, at most, it would be like $4,000 or something like that, extra. And the companies were like, absolutely not.
Yeah.
But another major part of the strike, which for the most part was steps forward at least, was striking for better conditions and better communication, in which they did not get probably to where these things should be, but there were some important steps forward that were netted from that strike. Including, like we said, you have to know at least the tiny, tiny bit about the game. And I do think, it wasn't clear that this happened at first, but it does look like now that sessions that include extreme vocally stressful things are capped at 2 hours as opposed to the usual 4-hour session. And you get paid the same.
Yeah.
Because another thing, we didn't talk about this in talking about the efforts and talking about games too much. But Emma talks a little bit about how motion capture is sort of obviously you're putting yourself at more risk. But you don't think too much about voice actors injuring themselves. But folks, vocal hemorrhages and vocal nodes, those are no joke. Those are really bad. And they happen to performers all the time when they are either not taking care of themselves correctly or more often when they are not being taken care of by their producers correctly.
Yeah, stuff like where you have to do a lot of screaming or a lot of crying are generally a lot pretty vocally exhausting.
And whispering.
Not just that, but those are two, like, easy examples to be like, yeah, you can see how screaming for 4 hours might be a little bit much.
Yeah. Even if you're trained. Like, obviously there are ways to scream in a more healthy way.
Yeah.
There have to be. Or no one would ever be able to have emotion in anything. Anything entertainment-wise. But still, even if you're doing healthy screaming for 4 hours, that's a long, long, long time. It's not like in a play where you might scream once or twice over the course of 2.5 hours. Or even like a movie where, you might do a bunch of takes of like one scream in a scene.
Yeah.
But for this, you literally can be doing different screams and different, like, deaths. Especially if you're in there just, like, as someone who's recording all of the nobody enemies dying.
Yeah.
Which is really common. To have people in to record just a bunch of different voices.
Additional voices cast.
Yeah. You can imagine that that's awful and painful. And not just awful and painful, but can be, like, really permanently badly damaging to your voice. And nodes and hemorrhages are a bad thing if you're a normal person, but if you're a person who, not that voice actors aren't normal people, but if you're a person who makes their money predominantly on the use of their voice, that's really bad.
Pretty bad.
Real bad.
Super bad.
So, a little more protection in that space. A little bit, at least, anyway. And instead of a residual of any kind, you get a little bonus if you come in for more than one session. Up to 10. For a maximum of an additional $2,100.
Lovely.
For reference, the day rate is like 800, 900-ish now, roughly, for 4 hours of work. Which, doesn't sound too shabby to me. But if you think about the amount of money being thrown around on these games, and the fact that even if you're like a big star, you might be making double that, it doesn't sound like quite so much money if you think about what Brad Pitt is making on his movies. Or even what Brad Pitt would be making if he was voicing your character in the game.
Yeah.
Because Hollywood's coming.
Oh boy, they're coming.
Oh boy. Anyway, one other big thing around the strike that I wanted to talk about is like the bad faith argument about residuals that is everywhere. The big reason, again, to be clear, SAG was asking for about a cap of like 3,100, 3,500 in residuals, if I'm remembering correctly. It was not significantly more than that. But the big argument against it is, well, if we give the actors residuals, like, they came in and they screamed for a few hours. Big deal. What about the coders who've been working for years? They don't get residuals. Why should this actor get residuals when the coders don't? And just capitalism is bad.
Yeah. I always hate to see arguments like that. It just, like, the whole, like, when the answer is always like, well, two things can be bad at the same time. Like, we can appreciate that coders probably, or in some companies, aren't getting treated as they should, and be concerned about how much voice actors are making,
Yeah. It's just, to me, it's like, it's just a bad comparison. Like, obviously, like, the coders are getting paid a salary, like a normal salary, in a way that
ideally, it should be said.
Hopefully, the coders are getting paid a normal salary. You would hope at these gigantic companies, maybe they're not making as much money as they should be making, because of course they're not, but...
I mean, it depends, like, what their role is and when they were brought on, right? There's a lot of contractors at big companies that are brought on for the last push, for instance.
Fair enough. But on top of that, it's hard to quantify the actors. There are a bunch of editors who work on any movie. They're not getting residuals.
Yeah.
And as acting becomes a bigger and bigger part of games with every passing game, it does seem like, and as the game industry makes more money every year than film and television combined,
yeah,
it does become more and more of a bad faith argument.
Yeah.
Also, somebody has to be the first person to get residuals, right?
Yeah.
Like, somebody has to be the first, and the argument will always be there that's like, well, if so-and-so gets them, shouldn't so-and-so get them? And the answer is yes.
Yeah.
The answer is, well, the actors have a union.
Yeah. Ouch, Madeline. That's a low blow.
Look, listeners, you do not know how much thinking about SAG-AFTRA I have had to do over the past 6-ish weeks. Have you been following the dispute between SAG-AFTRA and Actors Equity? If you haven't, isn't that nice for you? Have you had to figure out the SAG New Media Agreement again for so many projects? Have you had to think about COVID testing for an in-person filmed project? If you have, man, things suck, don't they? Anyway, The point being that I have no great love for SAG-AFTRA. They have been making my life pretty hard the past couple of weeks. And they have no great love for video game actors, to be clear, right? It's not like this is a huge part of who they're representing. It's not like this is where the union's money is coming from. But they still had a union, and they were able to get something from it. And maybe that's the takeaway, isn't it?
Yep.
Anyway. Well, Emma, speaking of movies and stuff, why aren't video game actors, famous? Yeah, when do you think video game actors will be famous?
Well, I mean, there are certainly actors that are famous, once you're into that, right?
Yeah.
Once you're into video games, you know who Troy Baker is, you know who, this is funny because I'm blanking on her name, but the woman who plays Ellie.
I haven't played these games. I don't know who plays Ellie.
Still, or you know who Laura Bailey is.
Yes.
You know...
I didn't want to embarrass myself and, give the wrong of the 3 women who are voice actors.
Laura Bailey plays Abby in The Last of Us 2. She doesn't play Ellie. It's Ashley something. I'm getting stuck on Ashley Birch, but that's not the one.
Is that not it?
No.
Nice. This is the point, though. The fact that I can't name the person who played this incredibly famous role. The first game to have a narrative.
Yeah, but yes, the first game to have a narrative. The Last of Us.
Are you looking it up? You are, aren't you?
Yeah, I feel bad about it, so I'm looking at Ashley Johnson. That's who it is. But once you're into video games, you start picking up some of the bigger names, and when you pay attention to anime dubbing, well, actually, in video games, there's 2 categories, right? You start with the dubbing roles, the Japanese games, and then you were brought up into the world of Western releases, which has generally been the story for Troy Baker and Laura Bailey and etc. So you get that is also the thing of there are very few voice actors sometimes, it feels like.
Yeah.
Working on large games. But you get sort of the same sort of group. If you play Fire Emblem Three Houses, those are all the voice actors.
Everyone who is in games. Troy Baker's not in that.
Oh,
yeah.
darn.
He probably is. He probably came in to do like an additional voice just to grab a cool 900 and be like, I'm out, buddies.
Yeah. But I think, like, when you pay attention, there are certain actors who are definitely more well-known. But I don't know if you'll ever get to the point where, like, you have, like, superstars like Brad Pitt or something.
I feel like with
and a lot of that comes down to, like, they're just less visible, right?
Yeah.
Like, you don't see Troy Baker's face, generally.
Well, you kind of do, sometimes. I do think motion capture has the possibility to make some people famous.
Yes. Although motion capture these days tends to lean towards using other people as face models.
Fair enough.
Versus actually... Like, in the early days of motion capturing, like, Until Dawn, you had, like, all the actors looking like really freaky versions of themselves.
Yeah.
Really scary, uncanny, shiny versions of themselves. But, like, Troy Baker doesn't look like Joel, right?
Well, yeah, I know.
So, you don't really, like... They're just not as face forward, and people latch on to faces, right? So they're just not as, like, marketable as people, you know? It's very rare that you get to, like, household name status as a voice actor.
And the problem is that the point of voice acting is that you don't... Like, I feel like the people that become celebrities in the acting world, for the most part, do that because it's Tom Cruise in every movie, right?
Yes.
And you get you know, to the top tier of voice acting by being able to become a bunch of different characters.
Yeah.
And so one of the big high-profile stories out of that SAG strike, right, the big game that lost its star was Life is Strange, where Ashley Birch, not Ashley Johnson, Ashley Birch, wasn't able to return and reprise her role. And I was seeing an article where, like, she and another voice actress were talking about it, and, like, they had, like, read reviews that was like, the new actress, who's non-union, of course, is indistinguishable from Ashley Birch. And she was like, F that.
Yeah.
Like, that is another kind of negative ramification of the strike, is that it made a lot of producers realize they could work non-union.
Yeah.
Which is probably bad. Probably bad.
I mean, I think you certainly get that to a certain degree, even, like, within union, right? Of, like, for a while, like, I know Matt Mercer now, but for a while he was just the guy that can sound like Troy Baker. But isn't, so you don't have to get Troy Baker.
But surely Matt Mercer even, like, if you think about it, surely he doesn't make most of his money from voice acting, right?
Sure,
like,
yeah.
Surely he makes most of his money from D&D.
Yeah.
Which is just, it's crazy to think about. It's like, that's a guy who's like, there are a bunch of characters that he's played that I'm like, I know that character, like, he did a good job.
Yeah.
And this is still, and big games, right?
Yeah.
Games you've heard of. And this is still certainly not how he makes his money. And there was a good article I was reading, that spent a lot of time with Jen Taylor, who plays Cortana in, like, all the Halo games, basically. And, like, Nathan Fillion was in doing a guest spot. And he said to her, you know, if you don't do one of these games, fans are going to be upset, but they're still going to buy the game. Which, like, what a, like, a horrible thing to say to someone.
I mean, what's the context is the question there, right?
Yeah, I mean, I know. But it's...
I'm sure he didn't just walk up to her and just
like,
say that, walk
you're
away.
Expendable. Maybe he did.
Maybe he did. It's all about the context.
But it's true, right? You know, I feel like with movie sequels or in television, if you replace a character, like, people might not come back.
Yeah.
Right? Or if a judge on a reality show leaves, like, people might not come back. But in games, if you replace the lead act, like, I can't think of any situation where if an actor got replaced on a game, I'd be like, I don't think so.
Yeah.
I'm in too deep. I was gonna say maybe Kingdom Hearts, but I'd be like, I'm in way too deep. And
plus, like, Kyrie is different.
I know.
So
I'm thinking of my boy band.
Yes. You're right. If someone else was voicing Roxas and Ventus, you're right, it's lost me. I'm gone.
I would have to think about it. I'd be like, is this where I want my money to go? Or should I buy about $60
Jesse McCartney?
Soul? Jesse McCartney, top tier voice actor, but also a good example of Hollywood coming on in.
Yeah.
Not that he's really Hollywood.
Yeah, the Kingdom Hearts is more the Disney Channel.
That's very true. But it is a danger. It is something that people seem to be worried about, is that there's already not very many jobs that pay very well and not that many opportunities. And...
I mean, you see that with animation.
Yes.
Right? Just Disney movies, Pixar movies. You hire big name actors now. You don't hire voiceover artists.
But it's so idiotic for games, I think. Because, again, I saw an article that was talking about this. That was just like, nobody... Maybe... Are people buying Cyberpunk because Keanu Reeves is in it? No.
People were hyped about it.
Sure, they were hyped about it. You got a PR boost. But, like, that's gotta be, like, the highest profile celebrity thing that's almost ever been done in a game. Right? It's, like, literally is him.
I don't remember what the game was anymore, but they had, one of the Halos or Call of Duty or something, but, like, Peter Dinklage came in to do it, and he was so awful that they had to replace him. Like, fans hated his voice acting performance so much because it was just emotionless. Which, like, what doesn't matter. Like, he doesn't know he's not a voice actor.
Yeah.
Right?
It's a skill.
Yeah.
Peter Dinklage is a very good actor, but
yeah,
that doesn't mean that you're a good voice actor.
Yeah.
It's true. But this article that I was reading said, like, part of the problem is that sometimes, though, games will blow their budgets on celebrity actors, and then somebody who was being interviewed who was like, I had to walk off a thing because they wanted me to do, like, 20 different characters being killed in a session, and I was like, I'm just not going to do this, because they were out of money.
Yeah.
Which just feels dumb. Like, in movies and television, people will watch things because there are actors that they know. I can't... The games doesn't feel like it's there.
Yeah.
At least not at this point. That could certainly change. Hollywood could certainly, like, fully take over. But...
the gaping maw of Hollywood.
Could just eat it whole. Absolutely.
One thing that is sort of unique to voice acting, and has been an issue in video games, is the issue of, like, representation in voice acting, right? Like, we had one of the, very surface level Black Lives Matter things that the entertainment industry did was replace a lot of characters of color that had been previously voiced by white actors. A lot of white actors stepped down from their roles as characters of color, right? And if you look at video games, a lot of the highest, there's already not a lot of characters of color in video games, and if you look at some of the higher profile ones, they are generally voiced by white people. So like Laura Bailey, for instance, voices Nadine, who is black from South Africa. But when she was initially offered the role, they didn't mention her race. She just mentioned that she was from South Africa, which doesn't necessarily mean, yeah. So it wasn't until she had already taken the role that she realized that it was a black character. So that's also an issue for when casting happens, right? You don't know until you're already cast.
Race is not on that list of things that they have to tell you.
Yeah. Which,
in some ways, I understand from a just purely you're not thinking about this from anything other than the feasibility perspective of, like, oh, maybe they're recording lines and the character doesn't really exist, like, hasn't been modeled yet.
Yeah.
Right? I get it from that perspective. I don't get it from any other perspective.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately the main issue of representation comes down to the fact that the talent pool just doesn't have enough people of color or people of different backgrounds or sexualities or whatever, right? Or gender identities or whatever. Like, so when you're auditioning a bunch of people, if you have a talent pool and instead of having like, 50% people of color or more, maybe ideally, you have like 5%, like, of course you're going to end up in the end with a white actor playing a character of color because you didn't audition anybody. But especially when there's stuff like mocap involved, it becomes even more of an issue, at least for me, like, personally, right? Like, I'm not an expert on this and want to listen to people who have stronger opinions on it, right? But, like, when you bring mocap into it and you're actually starting to actually physically portray someone who is a different race than you, it feels even more, like, ugh.
Yeah.
It's
like, this isn't quite digital blackface, but
yeah,
it's not that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I read an interesting article from the perspective of Asian American voice actors in particular, and the kind of the dilemma, and this is something I've thought about in theater as well, of like, is it okay to cast someone who is Asian to play play not their background?
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Like, can you cast a Chinese actor to play a Japanese character? And this article was, it's an interesting question, and the article, I think, made the great point of that, like, even however you feel about this, like, an actor that has that background brings a lot of positives in terms of just what they bring to the table as an actor.
Yeah.
Like, for example, the actor who voices the lead in recent Talk This Podcast new game, Ghost of Tsushima, is Japanese American. And it was beneficial because he, like, knew more about the background and how to pronounce things correctly without having to be coached.
Yeah.
And also spoke both Japanese and English. And so, just, like, I imagine was probably helpful in terms of, like, making sure things like made sense. So obviously that performer brought something important and valuable to the table that someone who didn't share that heritage, even if they could have given an identical performance, wouldn't have.
Yeah. I mean, there is the idea in voice acting that it's, like, the appeal of it versus, like, real-life acting is that you can play, like, a wider variety of people, right, that don't necessarily, look like you in whatever way that is, right? And I do think it starts to become a trap when you're like, everybody must be exactly the same as the character they're portraying, right? Like, I don't want to say, like, black actors can only play black characters, or like the video I watched that was about, like, anime dubbing, for instance. Like, a lot of those are technically all Japanese characters, right? But it's not really feasible to be like, okay, we're gonna cast only Japanese people can do anime dubbing.
Yeah.
Or even, like, but just somewhere along the line, like, there was this decision made that, like, the equivalent of, like, Tokyo Japanese is, like, standard English, right? Even though there's no equivalence there, right?
Yeah.
Like, you can't say that, like, that's an equivalent. So you do get a lot of, like, white actors portraying the characters as opposed to anybody else. Or sometimes you cast black actors for black-coded characters, and then fans are like, she doesn't sound black enough. Oh. Yikes. But, I mean, I just think, like, the appeal of voice acting is being able to play a lot of different things, but you have to bear that in mind, especially when you add mocap into it, of, like, who is portraying what identity of person, and, like, is someone of that identity going to be able to bring something better to that role? And generally the answer is going to be yes.
Yeah, and my stance is, that's cool. It's cool that in voice acting you can play whoever you want, and even if I don't look like a 20,000 foot tall alien,
yeah,
I can play a 20,000 foot tall alien. And you know what? Wouldn't it be neat if we lived in a society where it really could just be like, everybody's really on equal footing here, and we just need to pick the person who's going to be best for the job.
Yeah.
And wouldn't it be cool if like that was the case? But one, like you said, I think it would be a very unlikely situation that someone who doesn't in some way share the background of the character isn't the best person for the job. But even if that were the case, I think that it's unlikely that the quality difference is so significant that the creation of more opportunities of people from marginalized backgrounds shouldn't take precedence over a 1% difference in quality, which frankly doesn't probably exist anyway.
Yeah.
And it's a shame that can't happen. I mean, I do understand in an industry where it's like, you've got 4 hours and you need the person to get it on take 2 at the best, like at the worst, right?
Yeah.
And to get through everything, I do understand the penny pinching aspect of wanting to work with the same people who are reliable over and over and over again. But it is a shame in an industry that doesn't have that many, where sales and this sort of thing are not driven by voice actor star power. It's a shame to not, that the diversity problem is the same as everywhere else in acting, in an industry where it's like, well, but here it doesn't even matter if the person is famous.
Yeah.
Right? Like, they're probably not getting mentioned in the review unless it's Troy Baker.
Yeah.
So, might as well cast anybody.
Yeah.
Especially when people like Gearbox are scabs anyway. And remember that whole Troy Baker nonsense with them that never got resolved?
Yep.
So, like, especially when people are, like, avoiding working with the union if they possibly can anyway, hire people.
Yeah.
Good lord.
I did read a little bit, I can't remember the name of the game now, but it was, like, an indie game that got a little bit of flack a while ago for, like, their characters of color and, like, proudly putting, like, the voice actors next to them, and they're, like, all white. But they were talking about, like, there's this one character who's Scottish, and he has, like, 2 mixed-race children who they also wanted to be Scottish, and they wanted one voice actor to do both the small boy and the small girl with Scottish accents. Okay. So they had a lot of trouble. Like, that's a very narrow thing, right? Yeah. But they had a lot of trouble. They said they had a lot of trouble, like, finding anyone who could do that. But then, like, a while in, like, someone posted on Twitter about it, and actually through Twitter found, like, a black actor who could do that for them. And they're talking about how, like, it's not, you can't just, like, Google black voice actors who can do Scottish accents, right?
Yeah.
So, like, there's a lot of, on the industry side, too, and this wasn't, like, a smaller studio, right? So, voice acting with indie studios, there's complications with budget and stuff. We won't go too far into that. But, like, I think there's some lack of knowledge on the industry side about where to actually go to find new talent to introduce into the voice acting, family or whatever. So that's why you end up sometimes seeing, like, a lot of the same people because they have already proven that they can do it, right? Like, that they're good actors. So in some ways, like, no matter the role, sometimes they're like, well, it's easy. I know this person. I know they're free. Let's just get them to do it, as opposed to actually going out and figuring out ways to actually find new talent outside of just Googling it.
Well, I hate to say it, but that's the performance industry as a whole. That's not just video games. That's what theater has been grappling with, especially since the Black Lives Matter protests this spring, really visibly for years. Yeah. So, games almost has a little bit more of an excuse, because at least they are coding idiots. don't know anything about performance. Like, at least we can say, well, they've probably never been to the theater. I'm just kidding. But you know what I mean.
Madelyn.
No, I'm just joking. I'm joking. Like, I feel like they have a little bit more of an excuse.
Merching the names.
They're busy crunching for 6 months at a time.
Oof.
Yeah. Speaking of needing a union. Anyway, that's the, unfortunately, the performance industry as a whole. Whatever. I'm as guilty of this as anybody. You don't want to take a risk on people because you don't want to work with someone who's bad. But
Yeah.
I hope that the COVID necessitated everybody records from home stuff might broaden the possibilities of getting to work with folks who are not in your, I don't mean bubble in the COVID sense, but in your, like, talent bubble.
Yeah. Even in the COVID sense, actually, like, because they were, like, the 13 Sentinel stuff, going back to that, like, technically they were all local to, like, the Atlas recording studios, which I think is somewhere in California. So, like, there's also that aspect of, like, needing somebody who lives in the correct area, just like in, you know, other performing industries, but there's less of an excuse than with, like, theater.
Well, it becomes very challenging with SAG, though, because the thing is, and this has been something that, again, I've been looking at as I've been working with SAG in different contexts, is that you, if you're working with union actors, you pretty much need to work with just union actors, or actors who are ready to put themselves on the path to the union. You don't get that many opportunities to work on set. You get like 2, basically, before you have to join up. And if you're not living in LA or New York or like maybe Atlanta, Toronto, I guess, you know, how much really paying union work is there?
Yeah.
Not, you know, you have to be living in LA, and not everybody can be living in LA for one reason. Not every person.
But that's what I was saying, like the COVID thing, right?
Yeah.
If nobody can go into the studio anyway, maybe that opens up reach to other areas for people to actually do voice acting.
Absolutely. It does only open up the reach to people who can do death cries in their apartment.
Yeah. That's fair.
But still a much broader range. The people who are worried about that are already living in New York and LA. So, maybe the point is moot. But yeah, I hope everybody having figured out how to record from home will make it more possible to find the kind of diverse talent that can't afford to live in LA.
Yeah.
So fingers crossed.
Well, that's our episode.
Sure is. Listeners, do you have favorite voice actors or a favorite voice acting performance? If you were to describe yourself as an effort, what effort would you be? Should I write that block?
Fun Easter egg from this episode. I am actually Madelyn imitating Emma's voice. And Emma is actually Madelyn imitating Emma's voice. That didn't work. That didn't make sense. I confused myself as I started saying that.
Madelyn actually didn't do this episode. Emma just recorded both halves. Actually, Emma scripted this episode, and we recorded it totally separately. And Emma spliced it together. Crazy, right?
Yeah, the magic of voice acting.
I might write the "Which effort are you?" vlog. I feel inspired. I need to find some good examples.
Uh-huh.
I'm Yahoo! That's mine. That's me.
Good. That's a good one.
Anyway, listeners, have you ever voice acted for something? That would be cool if you were out there. Tell me about your experience. Do you also have a love-hate relationship with SAG-AFTRA? Or any other responses to the show? You should follow us and tell us about it on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at Talk This Podcast. So loath as I am to encourage you to enter social media, do it. Follow us. You should also check out our website, www.talkthispodcast.com, where you can read all about the show, about me and Emma, or Emma and Emma. Who knows? Does Madelyn even exist? Or has this just been Emma putting on 2 different voices the entire time?
It's getting too meta.
Only time will tell. You can also check out the games that are in the hat and our blog featuring long-running series Clickbait Boyfriend, where my boyfriend plays the games with the best voice actor of all time, Jesse McCartney, and god tier voice actor.
Oh man, will Beautiful Soul be the bonus track in Melody of Memory?
You stop that.
That's the secret ending. There's not actually a secret ending. You just unlock, like, a song, just question mark, and you click on it, thinking you're gonna get some, like, big lore reveal, and it's just Beautiful Soul by Jesse McCartney.
No, it's Lance Bass as Sephiroth. Anyway, can you imagine if he had voiced Sephiroth in Final Fantasy VII Remake? Wouldn't that have been just chef's kiss? I welcome Hollywood to my games. Oh, man. Yeah, so I said Clickbait Boyfriend, right? Also, Split Screen, where we're watching Coffee Prince and My Hero Academia. Dubbed. Hey.
Yep.
Little tie-in. I don't remember what the games are for next week's show.
I'm 75% sure that the old game was Mafia.
Oh, that doesn't sound right to me.
Okay, we will check the old game, but the new game is right. definitely the Outer Worlds. Oh, it's right. Chrono Cross.
Nice try, though.
The old game is Chrono Cross, the new game is the Outer Worlds.
I almost corrected you, there was no the, but there is a the.
There is a the.
Well, if you want to hear that episode and every episode after that on Sundays at noon, you should subscribe. We are on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, Pandora Podcasts, online and on the app, Overcast, Pocket Casts, anywhere you can find podcasts, you can find Talk This. I tried to throw a little bit of voice acting spice into that one, but I messed up my line. So we'd have to do another take. No second takes on Talk This.
No second takes.
Next week, as I said, we're back. There's not even really a first take on Talk This, to be honest. Next week, like Emma said, we're back with Chrono Cross and the Outer Worlds. And in 2 weeks, it's that time. We'll be talking about what games we've been playing the past 6 weeks.
I will not have a lot for that.
Well, get ready for the Yakuza Hour. Get ready for Madelyn has played all the way up through 7.
Work on your best Kiryu impression.
Nani?
It's not deep enough.
Nani?
There you go.
My boyfriend and I do that all the time now because every 3 lines Kiryu goes, Nani? Well, folks, that's it for this week's show. Emma, do you wanna should we sign them off with our best? Give me an effort. We gotta do an effort together to sign everybody off.
Okay, it's the goodbye effort.
What is that?
Oh!